Okay, so before I get into some more detailed analysis that we have done of the Neanderthal genome comparing to humans, I am going to give a brief overview of genetics in sexually reproducing diploids. And this sounds complicated. It turns out it is kind of complicated, but in a really interesting and cool way. So sexually reproducing diploids are us and most of the other things that we care about, things that make a new instance of that species by having sex. It takes two parents to make an offspring. And diploids means that they have two copies of the genome, one that they get from each parent. So this is us. We know that we have two parents, and if we consider ourselves here in the current generation, I often consider myself in the current generation, but lately less and less. But for the sake of this explanation, here we are in the current generation. We know that we're diploids. Every chromosome we have two copies, one of which came from our father and one of which came from our mother. The thing that makes genetics in sexually reproducing diploids interesting is that the copy of each chromosome that we got from our father, it didn't exist in our father. And the copy of the chromosome we got from our mother didn't exist in our mother. It was a special copy that existed only in the sperm and in the egg that would make you. And every sperm and every egg have different copies of the genome. So how is that done? How does your father and your mother make the copy of each chromosome that they were going to give you that's different than what they have? Well, they take the two copies that they have, that they inherited from their parents, and they do something called recombination. They stitch one of those copies together with the other copy. So take the chromosome that your dad got from his dad and the chromosome that your dad got from his mom here. And where this X is meant to denote where this stitching together or recombination happens. And the chromosome that you get has, in this case, this green and light blue bit from your dad's mom's chromosome. And this yellow and dark blue bit came from your dad's genome. So your dad's mom and your dad's dad, which existed on separate chromosomes in your dad, are now put together to make a new chromosome that only exists in you, but you got it from your dad. It also existed in the sperm in your dad. Likewise, in the egg from your mom that would make you. This process happens. You might ask, well, where does this recombination happen? The first approximation is random. It could occur anywhere in the chromosome. So there are lots of very, very fundamental, interesting implications of this process. One is, if we ask, okay, along this chromosome, what is our own personal genealogy? How can we trace back through our own ancestry where we got a particular region of our genome? Well, it depends where in the genome you are. You have a different genealogy at every place in your genome. What that means is, here, if we are interested in, for example, a gene that is right here, maybe it's a gene that gives you a big nose, in my case. So I might ask, where did I get that from? Well, this part, if this is me in the current generation, I got this chromosome from my dad, and the light blue bit came from the chromosome that he got from his mom. And if this light blue bit, if the female is on bottom, she got that also from her mom. So I got that gene from my dad's mom's mom, who also got it from someone, and so on back through the generations. Maybe also I'm interested in a gene that's out here. Well, I got that gene from my dad, and he got it from his dad, who got it from his dad, if the dark blue is the dad on top. So my own genealogy across each chromosome is different depending on where I am in the chromosome. And that also means that every generation, you don't pass on all of your genes to the next generation. You only pass on half of your genes. Half of them are the genes you got from your dad, half of them are the genes that you got from your mom, depending on where this recombination happens. Okay? So another implication of this is, if you want to ask, how long ago in the past and who is the common ancestor between you and anybody else, the person sitting next to you, for example, this common ancestor depends on where you're looking in the genome. At some place in the genome, you may have a common ancestor 100 generations ago. And then you go down the genome to someone else, and because of this random tracing back through history, then maybe it's 2,000 generations ago. And then someplace else, you have a common ancestor 500 generations ago. There's always a person who is the common ancestor between you and anybody else, but who that person is different depending where you're looking in the genome. Okay? So that is genetics and sexually reproducing diploids. We can, and with that in mind now, it's possible to understand why having Neanderthal DNA is so interesting for understanding human genetic variation. So this common ancestor that you have with the person sitting next to you or anybody else, it's different as you go along the genome. We can draw this phylogenetic tree for a random place in the genome, and we know that two humans on average had a common ancestor who lived about 450,000 years ago. So on average, that's how long ago in the past it was. Different places in the genome, different common ancestors, but on average, that's how long ago it was. It turns out that it's 450,000 years plus or minus about 450,000 years. It's a Poisson process. The mean and the variance are the same, so it really is that much variance. So what's interesting, 450,000 years ago, there was a person who gave me a gene and gave a random other person a gene. Well, if we compare humans and Neanderthals and ask when was the last common ancestor population, that, it turns out, was about 300,000 years ago. So this person who was the common ancestor of you and anybody else lived farther back in the past than the last common ancestor population, the population that would split and lead to humans and Neanderthals. So that means that the variation that exists in humans today is largely derived from the variation that existed within that population. We might call them Homo erectus, or we might call them Homo heidelbergensis, or we can argue like crazy about what we call that population. But that population was not a single individual. It was a population like we are today. It had genetic variation in it, and that genetic variation is still largely the genetic variation that exists today. It was inherited in us, and it was also inherited in the Neanderthals until they went extinct. So in many places in the genome, a person may be more closely related to a Neanderthal than they are to some other person. This is the truth about Neanderthals and humans, how they're related to us. Our genetic variation is old enough that it's largely shared with Neanderthals, or was until they went extinct. So there are a lot of places where a gene, you will have a common ancestor with a Neanderthal before you have a common ancestor with somebody else. They're like a deeply diverging human population, but not so deeply diverging that they don't share a lot of our variation. Okay, so that's the backdrop against which we wanted to ask this question: has there been any admixture? Has there been any gene flow between humans and Neanderthals? We know that humans will often share genetic variation with Neanderthals, but if this population split that happened 300,000 years ago or so, if that population split happened before all of the genetic variation that exists in people today throughout the world occurred, then Neanderthals should be equally distantly related to everybody. If there was, and there wasn't, any East Africans or West Africans or Europeans or Asians, or none of that variation existed 300,000 years ago, and we know that it didn't because our ancestors were all still in Africa. If all of that variation is more recent than the Neanderthal splitting off, then the Neanderthal is equally distantly related to everybody. And this random recombination, these random gene trees, should mean some of the time the Neanderthal is more closely related to you, sometimes more me, but on average, it's the same. So we wanted to test this directly, and we sequenced the genomes of 5 individuals from the places shown here: Yoruba from West Africa, San from South Africa, a typical European, French guy, Han Chinese, and someone from Papua New Guinea. And one of the first things that we did was ask along the genome, how different is the Neanderthal, shown in the orange lines here, versus the human reference sequence, the sequence that was done back in 2001 that represents all humans. And likewise, compare all the humans that we sequenced against this reference. And we can ask, going in chunks along the genome, how different is the Neanderthal from this reference human? On average, I said this is something like 12.7% of the way back to the common ancestor with chimpanzee, but there's this huge variance. This is the thing where the mean and the variance is the same. Likewise, the mean and the variance in humans is the same, but the divergence is on average deeper for all of the Neanderthals compared to any of the humans. So on an average place in the genome, the Neanderthal is more distantly related, but there are lots of places in the genome where the Neanderthal is less distantly related than some other human is here. So the average is deeper, but these averages, the distributions, well overlap. I'm not going to go into this in interest of time, but go straight to this test, a very straightforward test that we did, comparing positions in the genome where one individual that we sequenced differed from another individual that we sequenced. So for example, the French guy and the West African guy, all of the places in the genome where they differ, so maybe the French guy has a G base and the West African has a T, we ask, what does the Neanderthal have? Does it match the French guy or the Yoruba? Our simple model that the Neanderthals are no more closely related to one than the other would predict that this would be 50-50. Half the time the Neanderthal would match the French guy, and half the time it would match the Yoruba, and half the time it would match any two that you put into this comparison. The observation was that that was often not the case. If we compared the two African samples, the South African and West African, it was statistically indistinguishable from 50-50. Likewise, if we compare any two non-Africans, the French and Papuan, or French and Chinese, or Papuan and Chinese, it was also statistically indistinguishable from 50-50. The Neanderthal matched one or the other half the time. But any comparison between an African genome and a non-African genome revealed a large and statistically significant excess of the Neanderthal matching the non-African genome. So the Neanderthals more often match any of these three non-Africans than any of the two Africans that we have. We find Neanderthal genes more often in non-Africans than Africans. So this was a little bit surprising because one of our samples was from Papua New Guinea, which is a place that we doubt Neanderthals ever live. Maybe their range extended into East Asia, but almost certainly it did not extend into Papua New Guinea. We've since extended this test with samples taken from Native Americans, compared the genomes of Native Americans. They're also just as much matching the Neanderthal as someone from who lives right outside the cave in Croatia. They have just as much excess matching of DNA sequence to Neanderthals. So the model that we have to kind of describe this very unexpected result is that when human ancestors migrated or dispersed out of Africa, this happened somewhere 70 or 80,000 years ago, and first came into the range of Neanderthals, admixture happened. Neanderthals and humans hybridized to some extent there. That population then, we know, spread to the rest of the world and eventually reached the New World about 14,000 years ago or so. But they're all descended from this original population that admixed with Neanderthals. So this small percent of the genome, 1 to 4%, we estimate, comes from Neanderthals, comes from this admixture episode that happened very early on, before this population dispersal across all of Eurasia and into the New World. So that's the model, that's the best model that we can come up with that explains the presence of Neanderthal DNA in all non-Africans now, and its absence in all Africans now. Okay, and that is how things stood for about 2 months, and then